Thank you, Sue. So, good morning, everybody. I'm really glad there's only half of you here, so I don't have to worry about all those people in the back. Can you turn the volume down a little bit, see if we can you hear me okay? It's always a challenge to get levels of audio set so there isn't too much echo, because echo is really distracting for everybody. And can you hear still okay if we just keep bringing the volume down until we get to a point where there's kind of a happy medium and people can still hear, but it doesn't echo quite so much? Try to come down. I'll speak more loudly, too, so that... How's it now? You still hear okay? Is the echo very distracting? Okay, good. It's probably worse for me, so I can ignore it. No problem. So first off, say it's a new kind of opportunity for me, and one I've been kind of looking forward to, since I've never really didn't know anything about this association as a national association until getting invited to speak here at this conference and learning about it through that. Worked with a lot of the individual art agencies over the years. We do a lot of work in different communities. So as you know all too well, very often the art agencies are really important interconnectors amongst different folks in community settings, but I didn't really know about the national. So give me a chance to think about how all this might relate to the work that we do. And I kind of want to just ask a couple of questions. And these are like for you. And I realized afterwards that, of course, I hadn't thought about the fact that you're all going to be eating breakfast. So, like, you would like just, if I just blabbed and you could just eat in peace, right? And here I am going to ask you some questions. But they're kind of simple, and it's not that they have answers. It's more like, in terms of what we might focus on this morning, to me, it always comes down to certain questions. And the simplest way I can express it is probably a really dumb question for you all. I don't think it's a dumb question for all of us, because I think it's an important cultural question. But it's probably a question that you kind of live. But maybe it's still useful to think about for a minute or two. The question is, why are the arts important? And I'd just kind of like to take a moment and ponder that together. In fact, my hope is we kind of ponder that for the next hour and whatever it is, 10 minutes or however long I'm supposed to go up here. But in a couple of different ways. And particularly, I'd like to consider it historically. And what I mean by that is past, present, future. That's what I mean by history there. I don't just mean past. So if you really consider us, and I mean us now as this species, us humans, why do the arts matter? And particularly if you start off by thinking about it from a long-term historical perspective. And by that I mean particularly, let's say, prior to this era. And by the way, in my lingo, this era is what we just always refer to as the industrial age, which is this era now. It doesn't mean that was before the information age. This is the industrial age. The information age, quote, is part of the industrial age. It doesn't succeed it. It was folded in to a natural progression of changes that have characterized the entire industrial age, by which I mean part of the industrial age. A defining feature of the industrial age is periodic shifts in dominant technologies. So computers, digitization of our lives, internet, that's just another shift in dominant technologies. That is the industrial age. Believe me, the automobile changed a lot of how modern society worked. Electrification changed as much or more. Catalytic cracking, polymers, all these things were significant shifts in dominant technologies. It is the industrial age. We burn more coal today than ever before in history. This is the industrial age, all right? And we create more steel. We build more automobiles than ever before in human history. This is the industrial age. So when I say past, present, future, I'm particularly interested in our reflections about the arts prior to that. So as long back in history as you're inclined to think. And keep in mind, of course, that terms like industrial age are very relative, because for the Eurocentric societies, which is U.S., is a European-centric society in many ways, or at least our mainstream cultural drift is that. the industrial age might be 200-300 years old in parts of the European culture. Other parts of the world, it's 30 years old. I just came back from China, so you'd say maybe it's 30 years old in China. But you get the general idea. And of course, prior to that, you've got the agricultural age, and prior to that, you have the way humans live for about 95% of our history, prior to the agricultural age. So I mean in that kind of long-term sense, past, present, future. Why do the arts matter? And any thoughts or reflections would be interesting. Why are they important to us? And particularly distinguishing that pre-industrial era, whether you think of it in terms of agricultural or pre-agricultural. And of course, there are parts of the world that have just been moving out of the agricultural era in the last 50 years. Yeah, go ahead, stand up and just call out, and I'll try to repeat. There are a couple of mics in the middle. If you want to find one, that's fine, but it doesn't really matter. I can kind of repeat if... Yeah, go ahead.
I've just been reading Daniel Pink's book, The Whole New Mind.
Right.
And the whole idea that you have to use your whole mind, not just part of it.
Great.
We focused on that linear part for so
Right.
long. And that all of that creativity and that big picture is necessary in business as well.
Yeah.
So that's only a subsidiary.
That's nice.
reason.
That's very relevant. She said she's been reading Daniel Pink's book, it's called The Whole New Mind. Yeah, Whole New Mind. And just this important idea that we need to use all of ourselves, all of our capabilities. And part of this industrial age, of course, has been a particular emphasis on the rational, conceptual capabilities, obviously a big emphasis on math, science, technology in our education process. Not good or bad, but like anything in life, it's easy to get out of balance, and it's easy to have that be so predominant. I mean, whose budgets get cut first, right, from an education standpoint? That kind of tells you the priorities of a society, just as it does tell you the priorities of a business organization, which budgets get cut first. And, you know, and it's not the math, science, technology. Okay? So there's one take. Please, back there. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to repeat the gist of that. I take it you can't hear too well over here, right? Right, okay. So she was connecting art to the human instinct to play. By the way, from a learning standpoint, our capacities for learning are intimately connected with our, as you called it, our instinct for play. The best learning occurs in play. The play can be serious too, right? Just as, you know, it doesn't mean it's not just frivolous. The word play is sometimes misunderstood, but it's that kind of exploratory impulse to just do something and do it for no other reason than you feel like doing it, was a kind of one way to define play. And that instinct is really important for the arts, and it connects us, again, to ourselves. It's not too dissimilar in a way to what you're saying about all of us. But that kind of instinct to play. I mean, think about it this way. If you don't play, what's your life like? Right? I mean, it's kind of obvious to all of us. And those people who have lost the capacity for play, we kind of know what their lives get to be like. Get to be very serious in all the wrong ways. Play can be serious, but there's something different when you lose that capacity to spontaneously do what in the moment you feel like doing right now for no other reason than you feel like doing it right now. And to that kind of impulse connects us to what we create in the play. You might almost say art is what we create in our play. Great. Other over here, right here.
Art making is making sense and meaning in a more complex
way we connect past, present, future in a coherent narrative, the way we make sense of a complex and chaotic world. So something else that's very important about art is this sense-making orientation, which is, again, very important to us as human beings. You know what? What's the sense we make of things? That word coherence has long been a really important word in all the work we've done on dialogue, which is really a discipline for collective coherence making. You know, how we collectively cohere. And by that, by the way, just to be clear, it doesn't mean come to agreement. That's something completely different. This really, agreement is a very inadequate word to characterize that collective sense-making. And back there, oh, and you have a mic too, cool. But it may or may not be working, who knows? Yeah, there it is, it's on.
Okay, now it's on.
Great.
I think art also is a way of helping us reflect and express our humanity. And there are two examples that I can think of, particularly on this. There was a film that came out a couple of years ago. It's a German film called The Lives of Others. And in that film, it's about an East German spy who is surveilling a director and his actress wife. And there's a scene in that I found particularly compelling. The spy comes back to his apartment. It's this East German apartment. He's been looking at the apartment of the director and his wife, and it's filled with art and color and liveliness. And his apartment is this drab brown. And this one wall, there's one little pathetic picture on it. It's as though he's tried to express some humanity through this one sad little picture. And you really get this sense of how art is an expression of our humanity. Yeah. The other example that I think is important to think about, particularly in these difficult times when we're sometimes faced with this conundrum of how can we afford the arts when we have to shelter the homeless and we have to feed the hungry, and isn't art a frill that isn't necessary? Right. I always argue that that's a red herring, that really it's a both and, not an either or. But if you think about this, we've already tried this, just sheltering people. In the 1960s, we built projects where we were able to house people, and we had things like Cabrini Green, which it housed people, but it bred hopelessness, despair, crime. There was no aesthetic value. So the arts keep our humanity alive.
That word you brought in there at the end, aesthetic value, clearly another kind of integral part. And it's never an easy word to describe, is it? I mean, I'm imagining this is familiar territory for a lot of you. You know, we talk a lot about values. You hear people talking a lot about values in organizations, and you know, when you go through a period like we're going through right now, where there's all this finger pointing at all these valueless people, you know, who all they wanted to do was make money and, you know, didn't care about anybody, and their value was money, and so on. And then there's always these, it's still like the birds migrating. You know, it always comes back to, oh, we need to have a restoration of a sense of values. Rarely in those conversations, which usually basically is a moral response, right? We've lost our morality, we've lost our moral orientation. I always find it interesting that rarely when people talk about the need to reestablish values, do they talk about aesthetic values. I find that very curious. Again, it's more like, you know, go back to our kind of religious values. I don't mean to criticize those, but there is something different in that phrase, aesthetic value, isn't there? That's different than a moralistic value. And again, it's not one or the other, but something feels kind of incomplete. I once saw some guy do a really interesting presentation. It wasn't even a presentation, it was a spontaneous reflection on some slides that were going up. And the slides showed all kinds of different pictures. A lot of pictures of trees and flowers and birds and people, and then picture of like a big waste dump and other things that were kind of features of our modern landscape that most of us would not consider to be very aesthetically pleasing. And then he asked a really interesting question. Why do we consider some of those pictures beautiful and some not? And it was a really, really good question. You could say, well, they just are. And in some sense, maybe that's a perfectly adequate answer. Except then he had a very interesting comment. He said, it's our history. Those things which we consider beautiful are a connection to our history. The comment that was made before about how it connects us through time. And it's a kind of a radical notion, and I'm not advocating this, but more kind of as, something to think about. You know, could a waste dump at some point become beautiful? Well, his perspective was, if we've lived with it for a few thousand years, maybe. But it was a very interesting perspective on what evokes an immediate experience of beauty. And it's a simplistic one. It's not in many ways very comprehensive. But that notion of connecting us to our history, what we consider natural, what arises in the natural course of being of us and our fellow species, we experience as beautiful. And it's a very interesting and kind of a little bit of an unusual perspective on aesthetic. It's hard for me actually to imagine a society with much of a sense of values, without a deep aesthetic value. Yeah, right here.
I think historically that the arts have been the way of connecting with the spiritual or with the larger than oneself. Yeah. And so when you think of the cave paintings and the communication with the animal world and the spiritual world, so I think that's gone through our whole history as humans, that we've used the arts and maybe not called them arts, but it's a way of communicating and connecting with the larger.
It's an interesting comment you made. We've used the arts, but maybe we didn't call them arts. You know, I don't know of any indigenous people, any native people, aboriginal people, as these different labels are used in different parts of the world. It basically means people prior to the industrial age and prior to the age of organized large-scale agriculture, which is, of course, the way all human beings live for the vast majority of our history. I know of none who have a term for nature. Yeah, an interesting reflection. We have a term for nature. We have an abstraction we call nature. Because we're so separate from it, we abstract the whole of it. Of course, they all have terms for Mother Earth. And they all have terms for heaven. But they don't necessarily have terms for nature. I think it's quite similar with art. My guess, I don't know. If you live it every day, you don't need a name for it. It's the abstraction called the arts. Notice, it's a big abstraction, which you only need as you become separated from it. Very much like we need a term for nature, because we've become so separated from it. If you are it, you don't have a term for it. So it's always seemed to me that kind of the big kind of evolution in part is when the arts become the arts. Right? When all of a sudden we've become so disassociated that we need a name for it. Years ago, we were doing a project with a group from the Bahamas. I don't know if you ever heard of the Junkanoo Festival. Junkanoo Festival is their carnival. It's a particular tradition in the Bahamian culture, very much like you find around the world, particularly where there's been this interesting mixture of the Eurocentric Christian traditions and earlier traditions. And before you go on your big Lent thing, you have a big celebration. Of course, in Brazil, they have their carnival. Other parts of the world have carnival. And the Bahamians have Junkanoo. And very much like carnival in Rio, basically everything stops in the country for 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, literally stops. And everybody builds these big exhibits. They do plays. They do skits. They build floats like, you know, you've seen pictures of. But what's really interesting when you talk to people, and one of the things they will always say, well, why is this still here? Why do you preserve this tradition? And they'll say a couple things. First off, it reminds us who we are, that connecting to who we are historically. Secondly, it breaks down all the barriers. Someone who might be very poor, who might have real disadvantage, no one knows this in Junkanoo. Everybody becomes a persona, and that's part of their way of doing their, everybody becomes a persona, and you create the persona you want to create. And one year you may create this persona, and next year you may create this persona. So the two things that really seem to sit at the heart of it is, one, this notion that in this process, all the normal social barriers, economic, socioeconomic distinctions, which we make as a matter of fact, disappear, as do most other ethnic or racial distinctions, just disappear. But secondly, this idea that you create a persona, and everybody does it. And of course, then it gives you this enormous exercise, right? You know, we all know the iconic masks of tradition in theater. This extraordinary social exercise of getting to consciously create a persona. They don't bother talking about the arts. They are living their arts. So it's always seemed to me that the big historical evolution occurred when suddenly the arts were no longer our culture. In fact, we had a very interesting interaction with those folks because we do a lot of work on culture. You know, use the word culture in our kind of work. What do you think it typically means? This is organizations, right? It's organizational culture. And it's an important thing to understand. You know, we'll talk in a few minutes about the implications of all this for how we manage and lead. So in that context, talking about our institutions, our organizations, your organizations, if you use the word culture, you typically mean the organization's culture. It's ways of doing things, it's deep habits, it's unquestioned assumptions, it's artifacts. And it was quite a wake-up. I remember these dialogues very vividly with our friends from the Bahamas, that they used the word culture in a totally different way. Their culture was their society. It's who we are. And you could see that they were living out a kind of history and keeping it vital and alive, where their culture was their society. It was the heart of everything they did. So about 3 or 4 years ago, we had a wonderful project with called the Native Science Academy, funded by the National Science Foundation, to acknowledge the fact and study the primary features of native science. See, a lot of Westerners, most of us who go to school, kids study science. What do they study? Well, they study science. No one says, oh no, this is Western science, an artifact or a set of ideas and insights and processes of the last 400 or 500 years. And we should really call it Western science, because that's what it is. But we study science like we invented it. Right? Isn't that interesting? That's called cultural totalitarianism, right? Like we invented this science. So we had this wonderful project funded by the National Science Foundation to gather different wisdom holders, and this was organized by Native folks, a wonderful woman who had retired from Berkeley, and took this on as a project she'd always wanted to do. She used to work at the Berkeley Center for Particle Astrophysics, but she was a Cherokee, and she had a vast network of Native friends. And one of the things that became very apparent, we were having this meeting in Chaco Canyon. I don't know if many of you have been to Chaco Canyon. It's quite an amazing place. And there are lots of remains of buildings that the Chacoans built roughly 1,000 years ago, 800 or 1,000 years ago. And with us was a paleo astronomer, a woman who studies ancient systems of understanding the universe, the astronomical universe. And she'd been spending long years at Chaco Canyon, still discovering more and more extraordinary astronomical knowledge built into the buildings, into how they're aligned, in certain windows that line up with very particular, not only solar, but even lunar astronomical events. And of course, today with computers, you can project all of this back to exactly what the star system was like 800-900 years ago to find out these alignments. And there's a place called Fajeda Butte, which is quite an extraordinary butte right at one edge of Chaco Canyon, where they have now discovered an extraordinarily sophisticated astronomical observatory built into the way they did ceremony on the butte. What became very clear to all of us, the one big difference of native science and Western science is none of this was written down in the form of laws. It was lived. The fundamental aim of their science was to live better. Not to apply it, not to make technology out of it, although that happened to some degree. That was all secondary. Their science was sung. Their science was danced. Their science was built into their buildings. Their science was, they're fundamentally aimed at how they could live in greater harmony with the universe. That's an interesting way to think about science. See, in that sense, science and art don't really sound too different, do they? When you sing your science, when your science is built into your stories, when your science is built into your buildings, when your science is built into your dance, where's art and where's science? It's simply how we understand who we are, where we are, that sense-making process that you referred to, but not only how we understand in an intellectual sense, how we live it, how it shapes our sensibility, how it shapes our discourse, how it shapes our everyday ways of living. So in that sense, you kind of trace science and art, these two, I would say, inventions of the modern world, as distinctions, as abstractions, back to something that's quite common, which has to do with how we live. Not something added on, not something peripheral, how we live. What does it mean to live well? What does it mean to live in harmony? What does it mean, as the Chacoans and most of the Southeast Native American, or as they would call Southeast Indian traditions, felt, you did your dances to maintain harmony, not just with the universe, but in the universe. Because if you didn't do your dances, the universe was not in harmony. So as I think about past, present, future, there's a big cycle that kind of comes back to me in a lot of ways. And as I'm listening to your comments, I'm really reminded of it. I think we've lived through a lot of things which are ahistoric, or at least unique in the last 50 to 250 to 500 years. Depends how you date this. But this last relatively recent period in human history. And what I would call the marginalization of the arts, the abstraction, objectification, and marginalization, which I think are inseparable. Abstraction because it becomes the arts, as opposed to our dance, our song, our buildings, our way of living. Objectification in the sense it becomes about things. And although I don't mean to criticize this, please don't take this as a criticism, a museum is a kind of a metaphor for the objectification of art. It becomes a thing that we might go and appreciate it. Notice that's the objectification process. And then invariably the marginalization, by which I mean we can take it or leave it. If we have enough money for it, we have it. If we don't have enough money for it, we don't have it. That's what I mean by marginal. It's not integral. It's not inseparable. It's not something that you can even conceive of not having, doing. Really, those peoples could not conceive of living without their dance, their song, their stories, their building. It was just living. Now, I thought it might be useful to start off reflecting on this for a real simple reason. When I heard the term sustainability, I, of course, associated it in a little different way. Today, everybody in every organization everywhere, I think that's probably not too much of an overgeneralization, is really worried about sustainability of their organization. That's perfectly legitimate. I'd like to suggest, though, that it is a feature of the time in which we live that it's inadequate and probably will turn out to be inconsistent if we always only worry about the sustainability of our organization as opposed to the sustainability of us. I used that term, industrial age, at the beginning because it's become a pretty useful way for us to try to make sense in our own ongoing sense-making of our situation right now. I don't particularly like the word sustainability, but it's at least lingua franca. It's the term that people use now. And mainly because it's a negative vision. And now, technically, in our work, what we mean by a negative vision, in a minute I'm going to shift gears and talk a little about what would all this look and feel like from the standpoint of leading and growing and living in an organization. But one of the features of that is to understand what we've always called the creative orientation. And the creative orientation has as one fundamental element of it the idea of aspiration or vision or something we're trying to create. The problem with the word sustainable, it's a crappy vision. Seriously. I mean, I'm not saying it's not important. Please don't mishear me. If I have an organization, one of my fundamental aspirations, or at least a desire, is that it be sustainable. But it tells me nothing about sustainable for what? It's actually not much of an aspiration. It's sort of like survival is our goal. Or as somebody once pointed out, actually one of the guys who's famous in the world of green chemistry and how we rethink stuff we make in the world, he said if someone asked you how your marriage is doing and you said it's sustainable, that kind of tells you the whole thing. So there's something a little limited about this word sustainable. But it is the theme for the conference, so we're going to work with it here a little. And again, it's what's on people's minds today, and I would suggest that it's on our minds because it's a way of kind of capturing deep concerns that we have. And we need to acknowledge those concerns. It's part of our current reality. It's part of our emotional and intellectual understanding of that current reality. We don't seem to have much future at the moment. Other than that, no big problem. And by the way, if you think there's any kind of, real question about that, ask young people. I mean, you may do this already in the context of a lot of the kind of work and projects you're engaged with, but really give, teenagers a chance to just sit and talk and listen, which we don't do very much, by the way. Whenever you put adults and kids together, I can tell you exactly what will happen. Almost like instant pudding, it just happens. The adults do all the talking. But if you actually discipline the adults to shut up and listen, you'll find out that young people have profound concerns about the future. Often covered up with a kind of a total, engagement with stuff right now, just don't bother me with it. Often covered up with a lot of anger and generally a high level of resentment. I'll never forget, we do this a lot, so I say this from lots of experience of dialogues with young people and adults, and I'll never forget one in which we had two 12-year-olds and about 6 adults. It was a small group, included the guy at that time who was the president of the National Superintendents Association. So he was just president of all the Association of U.S. Secondary and Primary School Superintendents. And he asked the kids, he said, what do you guys think about the future? It just, came up in the course of the conversation. It was a genuine question. He was really asking, do you think much about the future? What's your feelings about the future? And I'll never forget, without, like a moment's pause, this 12-year-old girl just looked him in the eye and said, oh, well, we figure you drank your juice and then you drank ours. So believe me, kids think about this. So the reason this word sustainability is kind of resonating, it's connecting with a chord that seems to be real to people, is it touches some very deep concerns. I just arrived from China yesterday, midday, and on my way home. I'll be home tomorrow. I live in Massachusetts. And it's part of a project we're working on to try to enable the Chinese and Americans to actually work together, our governments particularly, to actually work together on climate change. That relationship, the U.S.-China relationship, it really be quite pivotal. And by and large, I would say if you deal with senior people in the Chinese government, they're much more well-informed than their counterparts here in this country. They have no question about the science of climate change. They have a pretty good feeling of the urgency, and we're working at the university-to-university partnership, but to enable our respective governments to develop a shared understanding. And I have a lot of slides and stuff, which I don't think I'll probably show any, but one of which shows the actual global emissions of CO2. As most of you know, CO2 is the primary of several greenhouse gases that are driving climate change. Actually shows the emissions of CO2 worldwide against a set of projections made by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. That's the group of the network, global network of scientists around the world who received the Nobel Prize a year and a half ago for their work to help the world's people understand just what's going on in our climate. Anyhow, and so the slide shows this range of projections from best to worst case scenario, and then it shows the actual data from 2006, 2007, and 2008, which is worse than the worst case scenario. So all the talk about climate change, which is now getting to be a real topic around the world, still has not been met with action. And I have a quote, which again I don't think I'll bother showing you right now, from Rajendra Pachauri. He's the chairman of the IPCC. He's a gentleman who actually received the Nobel Prize in November of 2007. In August of 2007, in which he says, we have till maybe about 2012 to turn this situation around. Beyond that, it'll be too late. Now, I just use this to illustrate. In some sense, climate change is a particular gift to us. I believe this very deeply. It's a little bit like if any of you have ever had a good friend who had a heart attack or a stroke at the age of 35 or 40. And suddenly, they had this wake-up call. And the problem is really not about their heart. I mean, there's a kind of an immediate, circumstantial set of problems around their arteries or their heart or whatever, but that's clearly not the problem. The problem is the way they live. That did happen to a good friend of mine, and it was an extraordinary gift to him in his life. He realized he had to change the way he lived. That's what climate change is. It may be, you know how if you're not living well, your body will keep creating more and more signals, looking for one that might get through, until eventually you have that heart attack. And you find yourself, as Dave did, in an emergency room, rushed out of your office, lying there. And he said, as I lie on the gurney, and he was very fortunate, they got him to the hospital very quickly, no long-term damage suffered, just good fortune living in a country like this where, boom, he was in the hospital and, in about 12 minutes after he was collapsed in his office, he said, I knew exactly how this had happened. I don't think we're quite at that point yet as a global society, but that's really all that it represents. The problem is not climate change any more than Dave's problem was his heart attack. The problem is how we live. We cannot keep living like this. Today we use about 1 1/3 Earths. That's a kind of a common guesstimate by natural scientists, just in terms of you look at the health of our ecosystems, a third of which are in serious decay, another third of which are in serious stress. If you've ever heard of it, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, also another UN agency, despite its bad rep, groups like the IPCC and the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment have shown the UN can kind of get scientists around the world working together on really critical issues. But our kind of way of living is not only not going to continue because of things like climate change and deterioration of ecosystems, we've lost half the topsoil in the world in the industrial age. It takes nature a long time to regenerate topsoil. We're the first species probably in the history of life on this planet that systematically destroys species, primarily by destroying the habitat in which the species operate. But these are not just environmental problems. The industrial age has produced extraordinary wealth and extraordinary imbalance. The World Bank said in 2001 that if the poorest quartile of the world's people from 1975 to 2000, that last quarter century of the preceding century, The poorest quartile of the world found their income share of the world's income fall from 2.5% to 1.25%. And you've all heard statistics like this. I mean, there's a million different ones, and they all tell the same story. You know, this is the one that always boggles my mind, but I think I have it roughly correct. The poorest, the wealth of the 500 wealthiest people on the planet exceeds the income of the poorest 2 to 3 billion. I mean, it's bizarre, the concentration of wealth and power that's occurred in this age. So I always point that out because people often think these are a bunch of environmental, ecological issues. They're not. Believe me, there is no fundamental separation of the environmental imbalances from the social imbalances. They're two sides of the same coin. Many of you have probably heard of Oxfam. Oxfam is one of the most respected social justice organizations. They're not an environmental NGO. They're a social justice NGO, if you want to use that general label. The purpose of Oxfam is to deal with the structural causes of poverty, particularly in rural environments. We've worked with Oxfam for years. I have great admiration for the organization. It's actually a network, but the mothership is in Oxford. Oxford Famine Relief was what the origin of the term Oxfam. Guess what? And in Europe, they're extremely well known not only for their relief work and their work in the developing world, but for their campaigning. The fair trade movement, those of you who know a little bit about fair trade coffee and things like that, it's been a very interesting movement in the consumer area for the last 10 years, really got its big lift from a campaigning by Oxfam starting in 1998 on the imbalances in the global trading system. They have a report they produced in 1998 called Rigged Rules and Double Standards, which was all about the way in which the global trading system works to systematically disadvantage the poorer countries. In other words, if you want to receive money from the World Bank, you have to open your market, your domestic markets, to imports from the rich countries. So, in other words, you've got to buy our toothpaste, but we don't need to buy your coffee or textiles. The complete imbalance. So anyhow, the fair trade movement got its real lift in Europe, which is where it started, from Oxfam. Oxfam is extremely well known for their campaigning, really effective, incisive reports and campaigns. Oxfam's major campaign in the world today is on climate change. What's a social justice NGO doing a global campaign on climate change? Because they came to the conclusion that the people who will most suffer in the world from rising sea levels, spreading droughts, changes in weather patterns, increasing weather instability, will not be the rich people, will be the poor people of the world. So I just point that out to say this unsustainability, which is really what the word sustainability is all about, is not just about environment. It's really important to understand that. The fragmentation of environmental concerns and social justice concerns is in fact one of our problems. They're inseparable, they're connected, and in my opinion, their root is how we live. Okay? So yeah, we could fix climate change, and we could do, just imagine, tomorrow, miraculously, you wake up and read the newspaper, and fusion power has been proved economically and technically viable. Or suddenly, in the next 2 years, the world completely shuts down all the oil refineries, and we move over entirely 100% to wind and solar and all the kind of energy we know we need to live off of. But it just happens miraculously, in 2 to 3 years. So basically, the climate change problems are solved. Right? They're gone. What do we have left? What other problems would we have? Yes, we'd still have the way we live. The most acute problem in the world today, affecting the most people immediately, is water. It's water. It's not climate change. It's impacted by climate change, but it's water. About 1 billion people in the world do not have access to reliable, safe drinking water. The World Health Organization estimates that'll be 3 billion by 2020. Do you really want to live in a world with 3 billion people who don't have access to clean drinking water? So it is the way we live. And while there are all these symptoms out there, it's really important to distinguish those symptoms from something deeper. So while I'm not a big fan of the word sustainability, it's pointing at something. It's resonating because it's evoking a sense that we really don't have much of a future if we keep living the way we live. Okay, so let me just pause there. Let's get background. I want to kind of talk a little bit about foreground. So let me just give a little headline, because you guys already said it as I was listening before, and I thought, well, maybe just continue this. I don't have to say anything. So past, present, future. Why are the arts important? Maybe, they will have an importance in our future similar to what they had in our past. Maybe we're at the end of the period of objectification and marginalization. Maybe the museum once again gives way to the community, and it becomes part of how we live. And why might that be more than just a romantic ideal? The reason it might be more than just a romantic ideal is that we have to find a new way of living. It's that simple. We cannot continue our current way of living. If everybody on the planet lived at the style of us being, I think, almost all citizens of the U.S. in this room, we need about 6 Earths. And by the way, the Chinese are headed in that direction. And they kind of know it. The runaway freight train of consumerism and industrial expansion in that country, if it ever reached a scale where the average person lived at this standard of waste that you and I live at, you need about 6 Earths. We don't have a 6 Earths. So we have a kind of a crisis. In the traditional Chinese education system, another fun projects I get to be part of a school. It's the first school that's been sanctioned by the government in China since prior to the Cultural Revolution, based on traditional Chinese educational practices. All the urban schools in China, if you visit them, basically they're just like the urban schools in America. I guarantee you, but just maybe worse in some ways, more intense. Everybody's sitting in nice, neat rows, and teachers up there giving lectures, and kids writing in their books, and test, and we think we have high-stakes testing, and the term you probably hear in schools, this high-stakes testing. Imagine your whole future depends on how you do on the general exam and getting into one of the 8 premier universities in China. Believe me, they got high-stakes testing off the charts. But we've had a project for the last 2 or 3 years, starting the first school based on traditional Chinese approaches to education. It's really interesting. First off, guess what they most emphasize in the first 3 to 4 years, let's say ages 5, 6, 7, 8? Calligraphy. Drawing, she said. Calligraphy, what they call recitation, which is very interesting. It's basically chanting, but you recite the classics. You recite Confucius, you recite Mencius. Western educators looked at this and go, oh, well, that's the dumbest form of education, rote memorization. Totally missing what it was really all about. The Chinese well understood for thousands of years, a 6 or 7-year-old is not too likely to become a meditator. Maybe at the age of 13 to 15, they start with their meditation practice. But at the age of 6, they probably don't. So you do recitation. But in the tonal structure of the Chinese language, all you do is listen to this. And you realize they're chanting. They're developing that mind-body resonance collectively. And they spend a hell of a lot of time playing outside. That's what they do for the first 2 or 3 years. They do calligraphy, they chant, and they play outside. And it was well understood, unless you established a foundation of understanding, and I'm going to use my term here because I'm, in some ways, as you can tell, I'm not a big fan of the term, the arts. If you do not establish a foundation of the creative orientation as the foundation of a young person's education, that you really, all the intellectual, abstract, thinking skills, reasoning skills, which they consider very important, by the way, but they don't start to emphasize until the age of 9 or 10 or 11, which we now know from brain research is actually when kids are ready to start to deal with more abstract, symbolic, logical reasoning. But the age of 5, 6, 7, calligraphy, recitation, a lot of play outside. And by the way, having hung around this school now a lot for the last 2 years, the kids love it. And they just love it because it's sort of kind of who they are. So I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the creative orientation. Just as it is a foundation of, I think, real education, and I don't think the Chinese are unique in this, I just think they have a system that they developed over a few thousand years. I think you find very similar systems of education when you deal with native peoples, this kind of understanding that the creative process sits at the base of our education. So what do I mean by the creative process, and what would it mean if you ran an organization based primarily on the creative process? Now, please don't mishear me. I'm not saying that intellectualization and rational skills and analysis are unimportant. Quite the contrary. If you can use that kind of a Chinese education system as a metaphor, around the age of 9 and 10, they start working a lot on analytic, rational, conceptual skills. Very, very important in their place. But as a foundation for education, they would say, surefire formula for unhappy people. So what do we mean by the creative orientation? Because I'd like to use that term instead of the arts for a minute. And again, I'm not opposed to the arts, and then please don't hear this as a criticism. But just give us a chance to step back a little. So let me just contrast something and ask you. If I said, what's the difference between creating and problem solving? What's the difference between creating and problem solving? Just call out. I can repeat to everybody. Right? Problem solving is focused on finding the solution. What else? It starts off with a problem. You know problem solving until there's a problem, right? So something out there is a problem. Creativity, she said, starts anywhere. By the way, I'd like to, just for the sake of the next 20 minutes or so here, I'd like to use the word creating rather than creativity. I don't like the word creativity for a different reason. I think it's often used as a synonym for originality. Originality is great. And in the creative process, originality is obviously important, but it tends to put the emphasis on, boy, that's a new idea. I've never heard that idea before. Now, I'd like to suggest the creative process, or creating. It's a little bit awkward, but you can use the gerund, the creating. It really gets us to the heart of something that's quite different than problem solving. So already you said, one, you've got to have a problem out there. So problem solving is instigated by some circumstance in our environment that we don't like, right? We call it a problem. And then we go look for the solution. Did you want to add something?
I do. Can you hear me okay? I think that there is no difference between problem solving and creativity, that all of us understand that when you create a play or a score, that you start almost with a problem inside of you. There's something inside of you that you want to resolve, and you need to get it out. And therein lies maybe a conflict or something in you, and it seems like a problem may be something tangible that you've identified, but when you start with a level of creativity, maybe it's a problem you haven't identified, but once you see it and you get it, you know it.
But interesting that you use the word problem to characterize a condition, an internal condition, rather than an external one.
Yes.
And I definitely, thank you, that's really helpful. So I definitely mean problem solving in the sense of we got these problems out there that we've got to do something about. And I'm trying to use this language also because usually for us as managers, so I'd like to kind of set away this background here of culture and environment and all that stuff and really talk about our organizations. As managers, what do you find your life, your day kind of filled up with often? Problems, right? So that's why I'm kind of framing it this way. By the way, you could also make the same point as parents, right? What's your day filled up with? Problems. The crisis of the moment. So it's easy to become very obsessive about this. Right? You can just obsess on what are we going to do about this, what are we going to do about this, and we got this person who's a problem, we obviously got all these financial problems. So that's why I'm kind of framing this as a distinction. And I'll just say this now, it'll be clear in just a moment. This is not a complicated question I'm asking you in a sense. This is not about good or bad, black or white. This is not about either or. To be a skillful manager, you need to be a good problem solver, of course. Or maybe to be more to the point, you need to be able to help other people do a good job at solving the problems that arise. Because a lot of them ought to be solved by a lot of different people, not just by me. But there is a more fundamental point. The fundamental difference between creating and problem solving is a very important point. Pardon me? Yeah, I guarantee you, if you're working in the creative orientation, or you're busy creating, you're going to create a lot of new problems, which you'll have to solve in the course of the creative orientation. But what's primary? A question. Proactive versus reactive.
As I,
Creating, I'm using the word creating, if you don't mind. Creating encompasses more than just problem solving.
Well, problem solving involves a process of deconstructing, taking things apart, finding what contributed.
Almost always it leads you into an analytic process of kind of breaking things apart and analyzing
creating,
them.
you're trying to put something together.
Creating, you got to bring a bunch of things together. So look, there's really simple. I mean, these are all relevant aspects of the distinction. But just the word, just the meanings of the word, we all know kind of what problem solving means. That phrase basically says something exists in my environment that I don't like, and I want to make it go away. Or I want to ameliorate it, or make it less of a problem, right? To create, dictionary definition, to create. What do you think it means? Origin. To originate is usually a pretty good synonym for to create. Invent from nothing. To bring into existence. That's it. The verb to create, to bring into existence, to invent, to originate. Those are all pretty good synonyms. So I'd like to suggest to you that this is a profound distinction. It's very simple. It's kind of subtle in a way. It's not about creating is good and problem solving is bad. It's not black or white. It's what's primary versus what's secondary. Here's what I mean by that. If you find yourself living as a manager, as a parent, as a citizen, whatever context of our living, you find yourself living in a way that all you're doing is solving problems, we kind of know what that's like, right? First off, you never get done. There's an infinite number of problems to solve. And someone said a little while ago, it's an inherently reactive stance. Because a person used the word proactive, because problem solving is inherently reactive. Something arises, and we've got to solve the problem. As opposed to operating in a way where your primary orientation is to bring into existence something you care about. It's really simple. And again, the subtlety of this here is not a black-white distinction. It's what's primary and what's secondary. If you ask people around the world, what are the most meaningful aspects of their life? Just all cultures, all kinds of people. What do you think is probably the one response you'll hear most often? Relationships and parenting. Yeah. I mean, universally. And I would say parenting really is probably the simplest illustration of the point I'm trying to make. It's really easy as a parent to be totally caught up in the problem of the moment, right? In fact, and it's sad to say this, but it's the way it is. Doesn't matter if they're, 2 or 5 or 25. There's always something new. And it's really easy as a parent to get into a mindset where that's kind of what it means. And yet, at some other level, we know that what makes it meaningful is really simple. We're participating in another person's becoming a person. We're participating in the creative process. And it's one part of it's biological, but a much part of it is much bigger than just that. So as a manager, as a leader in an organizational context, the first aspect of operating in a creative orientation is living continually in the question, what are we trying to create? I am going to use one graphic because I've been blabbing a long time up here, and it always helps people to see a picture or two. This has been a simple way to talk about our work for a long time. Kind of three interrelated dimensions. The three-legged stool kind of picture is meant to convey an idea that these three are equally important. You remove any one leg of a three-legged stool, it collapses. And that left leg of the stool, that aspirational leg, is what I'm talking about right now. So in operating in the creative orientation, the most fundamental question is always, what do we want to create? What are we trying to bring into existence? And that can be just as true for a manager or a parent or just living my life in any domain in which I live. The term vision is a funny one. We started using it over 25 years ago in our work, and then we almost stopped using it because it became such a faddish term. You may remember, in the 1980s, and everybody had to have a vision statement. How many of your organizations have vision statements? Yeah, okay. Everybody had to have vision statements or mission statements or purpose, and totally forgot, the difference between a vision statement and a vision. But it's interesting, we've never been able to get away from the word because it just seems to be the right word. And primary kind of basis for me saying this is that, one, it crosses cultural boundaries. People all around the world understand what a vision is. In cultures of old and new, you'll find a lot of really important elements of their cultural wisdom has to do with the importance of vision. In the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, we have that famous line, where there is no vision, the people perish. Believe me, it's not unique to the Western Judeo-Christian tradition. Some of the most sophisticated, technically sophisticated writings I have ever seen in my life on the refined capacities to be a channel for and an articulator of vision came from, someone shared with me some ancient Hawaiian, Polynesian texts. It seems to be a universal understanding, this idea where there is no vision, something's missing. There is no spirit. There is no clarity. There is no answer to the question, okay, we got all these problems, but what is it we're trying to create? And if that's not primary, then I'll guarantee you the day-to-day problem solving will be. So, leadership 101 in a crisis, right? So let's just say we're in a crisis. Now, what's the crisis? Well, it's kind of a question, right? The obvious answer is, well, it's a financial, economic crisis. Fair enough, that's what everybody in the world says. I would say that a lot of the underlying sources of that crisis in turn lie much deeper in this kind of way of living and an economy which is basically built on virtually nothing in terms of real foundations in the social and environmental domain. Put that aside. Leadership 101 in a crisis, how do you help people deal with what's here now, which we cannot ignore? You're a manager, you don't have the option of saying, sorry, we don't have to worry about our financial stress. You don't have that option. That's something you got to deal with. But how do you do it in a way that keeps reconnecting people to their sense of why they're there? What really matters to them? And what do we want to create? So that if we can find our way through the stresses of the moment, we'll be more along the path we want to be to creating what we really want to create in the next 5 or 10 years. Because while that's really simple to say, it's exactly the opposite of what often happens. What often happens is, all of this vision stuff. Oh yeah, that great vision statement we wrote? Yeah, well, come on, we got problems to deal with now. See, that's the problem with vision statements. They're quickly hung up on the wall, stuck in a card in people's, wallet. And the real, there's only one acid test of any vision. How did it guide your actions today? That's it. If the answer is it didn't, there's a technical term for what the vision is. It's called bullshit. And everybody knows that. That's why most people in particularly big organizations are so cynical about this stuff. Say, oh, we see all this lovely stuff. By the way, Enron had a brilliant vision. I'm guarantee you. I've seen it. So it has nothing to do with the day-to-day. What leadership is always about is how you weave in our sense of purpose, mission, aspiration into whatever you must deal with today. So I said, Leadership 101 in a time of crisis. How do we meet the challenges of today in a fashion that reminds us, connects us of where we want to be in 5 or 10 years? The second leg of the stool is equally important for that work. You see there, it's called reflective conversation. What does reflective conversation have to do with the creative orientation? So think of all three of these as the core learning capabilities for operating an organization in the creative orientation. No sense of aspiration, forget it. The stool collapses. But what does reflective conversation have to do with it? You see that term mental model. I apologize, it's a jargon term, but it's just one that's kind of been hung around our work now for 20, 25 years. And it's a real simple idea. The idea is that none of us have an organization in our head. None of us have a family in our head. None of us have a community in our head. What we have in our head, what we have in our awareness, is a kind of an internalized set of pictures, images, assumptions. So for shorthand, this is a little inadequate. You could call that, substitute the word assumption for mental model. But particularly unquestioned assumptions, and even worse than that, assumptions of which we're even unaware, let alone unquestioned. Like an assumption could be, oh, arts agencies are always struggling financially. Just made it up. Okay? But that could be an assumption people carry with them. Now, I'm not saying there's no factual basis for it, but I'm saying something different happens, and this is what I'm trying to kind of point to. Something different happens when you go from a statement of fact, like, oh yeah, I can see that, we've been a little below our budget for the last 3 years, or this year, whatever the fact is, to something like, art agencies always struggle financially. What's shifted in that? Well, it could be called a moral judgment. It could be forever. It becomes kind of an internalized point of view. Now, points of view are inescapable as human beings. We internalize mental models. There's nothing wrong with mental models. The problem is not mental models. The problem are mental models upon which we do not reflect. The problem are mental models that we don't realize are mental models. They are just the way it is. So what I'm really pointing to here is all the things we take for granted as the way it is, like this is the way it is. You with me now? Can you see how that could really undermine the creative orientation? Oh yeah, our vision is to be a thriving enterprise, but art agencies always struggle financially. So you see how that could be kind of a problem, specifically? This is a subtle area. I'm not suggesting that you kind of suspend everything you know about reality. The old saying it actually has its roots in both engineering and the arts. To create, you must understand constraint. If you're a sculptor, you must understand the constraints or limitations of the medium in which you're sculpting. So I'm not saying you just suspend reality, but I am saying that you become aware of the assumptions you hold, which are potentially self-limiting assumptions, and you hold them as assumptions, as opposed to a statement about reality. Probably the classic example of this, and we've all heard this, like, well, you know how people are. And then you fill in the blank after that, right? You with me? And what comes after that, how people are, whatever is in that next phrase, is going to be some statement, almost always pretty negative, which is kind of a statement of excuse well, what can you do? You know, people just care about themselves. I would say, by the way, that's a very widely shared and largely unquestioned mental model in today's society. Numero uno, right? So when we see all this, you know, financial stress, what's the very first thing that we then see? We see all these people who only cared about themselves and how much money they made. And then I guarantee you one of the reasons that's so popular is it connects with a deep assumption we tend to hold, well, that's just kind of the way people are. You want to have a very interesting conversation with Chinese people. I'll use that as another example since I just came from China. Try having a conversation, by the way, same with Indians, same with native peoples, around the subject of original sin. It's a deep assumption in our culture, our now being the Eurocentric Western culture. The people are just self-centered. And of course, original sin elevates that to one step higher, right? And I'm not saying this to criticize. If I'm pointing at your part of your own religious tradition, please don't hear this as a criticism. I'm pointing at something else now. It's not the content of the assumption, it's the unquestioned nature of the assumption. It's not, oh, I have an assumption that people care about themselves. I guarantee you, if you say that, I have an assumption that people care about themselves, or I've internalized a mental model that people care about themselves, the very act of saying it that way shifts things. Because I've named it as something that I've adopted as opposed to a statement, an objective statement about an external reality. You with me now? This is a subtle territory. This territory of mental models is very subtle. I'm not saying the content of your mental models is wrong. Usually a lot of it has factual basis. What I am saying is holding them as unquestioned assumptions will profoundly limit the creative process. And you see the one other key word there, the middle leg of the stool, says reflective conversation. So what that's pointing to is that, generally speaking, one of the most powerful methods for continually bringing to the surface our unquestioned assumptions is conversation. Is serious exchange with others, where we encounter a different assumption. By the way, I don't know how many of you have ever noticed this. I certainly notice all the time. You encounter somebody who sees something very differently than you, usually our knee-jerk reaction is, wow, what's wrong with them? Right? How many of you ever noticed someone's English accent difficult to understand? Right? You encounter somebody who comes from another part of the world or maybe even another part of this country, and you have a little trouble following their accent. You with me? You experienced that? How many of you noticed your immediate conscious thought was, they have a difficult accent to understand? Right? They have a difficult accent to understand. You almost never say, I have a problematic accent. You with me? That would be just as accurate. All that's really happening is they have a way of speaking English different than my way of speaking English, but my immediate non-reflective way of responding is to see the problem as an external problem rather than seeing it as my own accent. That's what I mean by reflection. Humberto Maturana, who's been a teacher for many of us on many of these aspects, a very famous biologist from Chile, says this very succinctly. He said, it is only through reflection that we escape our history. It is only through reflection that we escape our history. An organization that can operate in the creative orientation is continually engaged in reflecting on their unquestioned assumptions, which could inadvertently be holding them back, primarily because they're taken as truths as opposed to assumptions. Okay? Just last leg of the stool. This one we could spend a couple days on. This area where I'm trained in, so I can really spend way too long on it. It's really simple, though. How do you help us all see the larger system? Since I'm going to wrap up here in just a minute or two, let me see if I can do it as a picture, because that'll make it much quicker and easier than any more words. maybe I can't. I have all these things here. I thought I have a little picture to show you of what systems thinking is like. What I mean by systems thinking. Ah, here it is. There. Don't bother trying to read the small print. It just says copyright New Yorker. Okay, he thinks he's fixed his problem, right? He had a problem, he fixed it. Except one small problem. Pretty soon he's going to have another problem, a bigger problem, because he doesn't see the system within which he's operating. So that's all we mean by systems thinking. How do you help to see the larger system? In most organizations, maybe yours not so much a problem. Big organizations, people will say, oh yeah, believe me, I know that one. But we promote people who solve those problems, and by the time it goes all the way around the circle, some other schmuck is sitting in a chair. So when I talk about understanding complexity, the word complexity is a technical term. It really means interdependence, seeing the system within which we operate. For me, this has deep roots in the creative orientation, the creative arts. You know, the play works or fails to work as a whole. It's one of the most important principles in creating. You're creating something that has to be whole. That famous line in poetry, or in teaching of poets, to make the poem work, you often must leave out your best line. Right? That it's deep in our sense of beauty, our sense of aesthetic satisfaction. Something works as a whole. And that's what that left leg of the stool is all about. So, I just want to wrap it up because we have to be mindful of time here. I want to come back to what we started. And I had a couple of things I wanted to share with you. If you go to the computer, so I was only thinking about this morning. I thought I better write this up. You put up the computer projector. You have a chance? Great. I said at the beginning, I think, at this point in time, there's a particular need to deeply understand the creative orientation, the arts. And I thought this morning of this thing, which I had actually a ratty old copy in my pile of slides. I'll just type it up. I want a cultural change. I want to contribute to a work of art in the domain of human existence. I want to contribute to evoke a manner of coexistence in which love, mutual respect, honesty, and social responsibility arise spontaneously from living instant after instant. That's the man I mentioned a minute ago. Humberto Maturana is one of the most famous living biologists. He's also an icon in Chile, his home country, as a kind of Einstein-like figure who has had revolutionary impact in the field of biology. By the way, his specialty is what he calls the biology of love, which I know might sound very odd to you, but it's rooted in something that he's very famous for called the Santiago theory of cognition, the biological basis of human capacity for awareness. And he's also a human being who has a remarkable kind of ability to summarize the essence of what it's about. And Humberto would say, you know, we have no future except the future we might choose to create. And we won't have an ability to create that alternative future any more than we can start re-immersing ourselves in the creative process. So it's no accident that he used that phrase. I want to contribute to a work of art. So similarly, your work of art as your organization. It's not a phrase I would use lightly. I mean it literally. Your organization is an ongoing work of art in the domain of human working together. And since I just came back from China, the one other thing I couldn't get out of my head this morning, simple way for me to summarize what I've been saying about we find a new way of living is this question. And I'm being posed as a question. What's the sensibility? What's the aesthetic of living together differently on the planet? These are not technical problems to be solved. Climate change is not just a technical problem, believe me. It's a deep problem in our living Flip it around to the creative orientation. You ask, what do we want to create? And I think a question that will become more and more critical for us as a people on the planet will be this one. What's the aesthetic of sustainability? What's the sensibility? And this is as good a statement of it as any, and you could find many statements like this. Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother. And even such a small creature as I finds an intimate place in their midst. Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my body, and that which directs the universe I consider as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. It's a very famous line. Most Chinese know this, but they've kind of forgotten it. About 1,000 years ago, called the Western Inscription, a famous Confucian sage. Just an example, but if it gives you a feeling, to me, there is no deeper question than what is it that will guide us? What's the aesthetic value? What's the aesthetic sensibility? What's the spirit? Without that, we'll just have a bunch of technical problems to solve. And so to me, that's why your work is so important for the future. That's it. Thank you.